All right, we're going to start with a quick primer for those of you joining me for the first time and those of you who have watched my videos before but aren't the best at media literacy. I know you're out there. I see your comments. I am a progressive voter who has been very vocally critical of many of Joe Biden's conservative policies. I voted against Joe Biden in the Democratic primary earlier this year. I'm appalled at the apparent state of his mental health in public appearances, including, but certainly and unfortunately not limited to, his recent debate. And I am deeply concerned about his ability to win the 2024 election. But this November, I will be voting for Joe Biden or whatever candidate the Democrats decide to run, up to and including a crate of apples, even if they're Red Delicious, which we all agree is the worst apple. Why? Because Donald Trump represents an existential threat to women, LGBTQ people, minorities, immigrants, secularism, democracy itself. So my choices are either to vote Democrat or not vote at all. And not voting at all will not work to steer this country in a more progressive direction. In fact, it will likely do the exact opposite. If progressives like me decide to sit this one out, we will help drive the United States further to the right, regardless of whether or not Donald Trump wins. This is my opinion, but it is my opinion based upon history and scientific research. I'll start by quoting historian Kevin M. Cruz over on his newsletter because he said it better than I ever could, and he knows what he's talking about. Regarding the belief that not voting will force the Democrats to realize that they need to move left in order to secure progressives, he writes, "This belief stems from an apparent misunderstanding of a voter's role in an election, one that sees a voter like a consumer. Much as consumers can band together to deny their support for a business and thereby persuade the business to change its policies to secure their support, these people believe that voters can band together to deny their support for a political party and thereby persuade the party to change its policies to secure their support. But it doesn't work that way. Businesses have a profit motive to chase down every possible customer because the more customers they have, the more money they make. Politics works on an entirely different set of incentives. A candidate isn't looking to win over every single possible voter. They just want to edge out their competition for the voters who did show up. The goal of any race is to get 50% of the vote plus one more vote. That's it. So boycotting an election merely shrinks the total pool of voters these politicians are fighting over. Playing hard to get actually makes it easier on the politicians you're hoping to persuade. It makes it easier because they can all just ignore the voters who are sitting it out and ignore their cause as well and fight over the ones who remain. And after the election, sure, there will be some calls to expand the base by reaching out to the boycotters, but those calls will be drowned out by the arguments from veteran campaigners who know all too well it's much easier to persuade people who regularly vote to switch to your side than it is to persuade people who might agree with you but never vote to finally get into the game. Now, Cruz doesn't cite anything to back this up, probably because he's a historian who has simply seen this play out over and over again, as with progressives voting for Ralph Nader in 2000 and giving us George W. Bush, or those sitting out in 2016, we ended up with Donald Trump. In that more recent instance, Dems quite clearly did not come back in 2020 with a super progressive candidate or agenda, which is why we now have no abortion rights and an 81-year-old conservative Democrat running for re-election. That said, I can offer some scientific evidence that supports this idea. In 2019, political scientists polled more than 7,000 Americans to determine why they weren't voting. By far, the most common reason cited in 40% of cases was that they were incapable of voting due to problems like being sick or not having transportation. Only 26% reported that they had voted in the past, but were choosing not to vote now because they didn't like or didn't know enough about either choice. So while it makes sense to say, hey, 55% of eligible voters didn't show up in 2016, let's try to get them to come out for our side, the actual number of people who say they even could be convinced to come to the polls is about a quarter of that. Maybe 14% of eligible voters. And it's hard to know whether they're sitting out because the choices aren't progressive enough, or they aren't Nazi enough, or aren't paleo-conservative enough, or whatever. That study supports what many others have shown. Most people who don't vote because of systemic problems, not because of the idiosyncrasies of each election. That's why so many studies that look at non-voter habits across many elections find that most non-voters just never vote, regardless of who is running. And that's why the Democrats focus on the people who are already voting, but not voting for them, i.e. the people voting Republican. And that's why we had Democrats in Congress try and luckily fail to pass an anti-immigration bill opposed by 100 human rights organizations instead of doing literally anything else. And just to be clear, by describing the logic behind these party policy decisions, I'm not defending them. I very much wish that we would remove all the systemic barriers to voting by making it standard to do mail-in ballots, by making Election Day a federal holiday, by giving all felons back their right to vote, except for one felon maybe, because it's very funny that Trump can't vote for himself now. Right now, because of these systemic barriers, voters tend to be older, richer, and whiter than non-voters. So changing things, removing those barriers, would improve the diversity of the people voting. And based on demographics and research in the past few decades suggesting non-voters tend to skew a little more liberal, this would slightly tilt votes in favor of Democrats regardless of their policy. And again, I very much wish that I was able to cast a vote for a progressive candidate for president this year. I cannot. But what I can do is wield my vote strategically. I understand the desire to vote as though it is a symbol of your deeply held personal sense of morality. As a resident of a liberal county in California, I was able to do that in the presidential primary earlier this year. And yeah, it did feel like a tiny victory to not vote for Joe Biden then. But I only did that because Joe Biden was going to be the Democratic candidate regardless. My vote quite literally meant nothing. But that's not true about the presidential election. I mean, yeah, Biden's probably a shoo-in even here in my blue county, but the stakes are too high. I'm going to vote for a Democrat because, unlike Trump, I know I can bully a Democrat into at least trying to protect my rights instead of actively obliterating them while I watch. And I hope that you do this too. Please vote for a Democrat. Check out the transcript linked below to find links to learn whether you're registered to vote, how to get registered to vote, where to find your polling place. All of that information is in the transcript below. Hey everybody, thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this video, please give it a like. If you loved the video, please subscribe. And if you think the world could use more videos like this and you happen to have a few bucks laying around, head to patreon.com/Rebecca and join an awesome community of nerds like the people whose names you see on the screen right now. Thanks.